Thank you very much, Kathy. Well, South Africa needs to step up its reform efforts to avoid its economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic losing steam. That is according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in a report it released on South Africa earlier today. The OECD released the Economic Survey of South Africa and cited persistent weaknesses in productivity growth and the negative impact of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine on purchasing power through the rise of food and energy prices that continue to weigh on economic activity. Joining me now is the OECD Acting Head of Country Studies, Isabell Koske, to talk more about the report. Isabell, thank you very much for your time. The OECD citing South Africa that it must improve the tax system and reduce spending inefficiencies to put public finances on a more sustainable path. You are warning that the economic recovery we've seen in South Africa since COVID-19 could be wiped out if we do not improve on these raft of measures. Talk to us about that.
Yes, thank you very much for this opportunity to share a little bit, the key messages of the report that we launched this morning with the Deputy Minister of Finance. Indeed, I think in our view, Africa is in a very difficult position at the moment. On the one side, growth is very low, productivity growth equally low, but at the same time, the public finances situation also does not look good with the debt level, has increased already before the COVID pandemic, but during the pandemic it increased even further, and the debt to GDP ratio reached 70% of GDP in 2020. Now, there is a need on the one hand, to restore fiscal sustainability, and here tax reforms can clearly help. I will talk a little bit about that more in a second. But at the same time, there is an absolute need to also foster economic growth, especially productivity growth. But this requires, again, some investment in education, health and infrastructure, which, requires also public funds in addition to private funds. So it's a difficult balance, that the government needs to strike to sustain fiscal sustainability, while at the same time, making the revenues available, for these investments. In the report, we highlight that there is definitely a need, first to improve the efficiency of spending. For instance, continuing measures to stabilize the government wage bill remain necessary in our view, and the moderation in civil servants' wage increases is very welcome in our view. Moreover, we see clear need for improving the governance of SOEs because they also put quite some pressure on public finances because many of them are underperforming. And here, more market discipline in the management and so on can clearly help. But also tax reform itself can help to increase revenues. Tax bases of many taxes are quite narrow in South Africa, and there are lots of tax exemptions and deductions that also increase actually income inequality, which is one of the highest in the world. So reducing these exemptions and deductions would actually help, first to raise more fiscal revenue, but also to reduce income inequality. And this revenue can then be used to invest in infrastructure, transport infrastructure in particular is important, but also telecommunication infrastructure, also to invest in better education, both at the primary level, but also at the secondary level, also at the tertiary level there is need for reform, and also ultimately more investment in as I said, in infrastructure. We also recommend.
I wanted to talk about also this debate that's raging in South Africa. You, as the OECD, are in support of making the 350 Rand Social Relief of Distress Grant a permanent feature in South Africa. Why do you hold these views? Because a lot of people are saying South Africa cannot afford another social grant layer.
Frankly, this grant fills an important gap in South Africa's social protection system because for the first time it provides support for unemployed people of working age, including informal workers and also people who are just entering the labor market and are not eligible for any other benefits. This was an important gap before this grant was put into place. And so we see a need, to keep it there. or replace it by some other measure to protect these people. Of course, it comes with a fiscal cost, no doubt. But we think that the revenue to finance this grant permanently can be found. For instance, as I already said, there's definitely room to raise more tax revenue from various sources. Also, there's a clear possibility to improve public procurement processes to save, some money in that area. For instance, by centralizing public procurement further and strengthening in general, the processes and so on. So we think that it can be feasible to make this grant permanent, and we see important benefits from doing so in terms of, the social benefits.
You are saying that raising the taxes of the wealthy, which is not something new in South Africa. We heard the governing party, the ANC, calling for the same in its policy conference. But there is a risk also to that, a view that says those who are skilled, those who are high net worth individuals would eventually leave the country because of the high taxes that they have to actually endure. How do you balance that with the need to ensure that you support the most vulnerable by ring-fencing those that tax income for the basic income grant or the social relief of distress grant?
Indeed. I mean, the thing is, as I said, the tax base in South Africa is very narrow, for instance, of the personal income tax, and only few people actually pay the personal income tax. These are, the richer people. But at the same time, these people benefit from a lot of tax allowances, tax deductions, and so on. For instance, fringe benefits are not, included, to their full value. So there are a lot of, rules that allow them actually to reduce their tax burden. We're not simply calling for, say, an increase in the tax rate, but what we're calling for is a abolishment or reduction in these special allowances that allow people, to reduce the tax burden. Of course, there's a risk always, that with higher taxes, people may leave the country. But frankly, these decisions are driven by multiple choices, by multiple things, not just, the ultimate tax burden in the country. So we think that this risk ultimately overall is small, and that it's really worth, going that way and reducing, these tax allowances, which really just benefit mostly the higher income earners. So that in some cases, even, the tax burden is actually lower than those of say, the middle income people.
You are also seeing that the GDP growth, you expect it in South Africa in 2022 to slow down from the highs that we saw from the low base to 1.8% in 2022 and 1.3% in 2023. And inflation, you are projecting it to be at 6.3% this year. Certainly in your forecast, this is the lowest one that I have seen when it comes to projections by National Treasury, by the Reserve Bank, the World Bank, the IMF. This is the lowest projection for this year. When it comes to the economic recovery, let's talk about what you are saying are the impediments to growth in South Africa and what policymakers should actually focus on.
Indeed, there are many things that the government actually can do to strengthen recovery and boost economic growth. As I hinted at already earlier, I think there's an important need to invest in education. You already mentioned that, there's the high skilled actually are quite scarce. And this is also what we are seeing. There are first skill mismatches, but there's also a lack of high skilled people. So South Africa needs to invest in the quality of its education system to equip more people with good, foundation skills at the primary and secondary level. And then also to ensure that, more people can actually attend tertiary education. Here in the report, we recommend, for instance, to change the funding formula of universities in order to reduce ultimately the tuition fees for people, because many people don't have access, to tertiary education because it is very expensive. But at the same time, also there are not enough places available. So demand actually is still, outstripping supply. So here clearly more investment is needed. Also, more could be done, for instance, to strengthen vocational education and training to make it more labor market relevant by involving, firms and the social partners, in these programs, and also to further strengthen adult education, because obviously there are also many people, already out of school that are currently in labor force, but that are lacking in the necessary skills needed to succeed in the labor market. Another important thing thing to boost growth clearly is to deal, with the important infrastructure gaps. Foremost, I would like to talk about electricity here. Electricity shortages are an important impediment to growth, an important risk also going forward. Here, in our view, it is very important to make sure, that the market is open to also other supplies of electricity. So the separation of Eskom into distribution, production and distribution, production and
generation
supply is very important. Sorry?
Generation.
Yes, so the separation is highly important so that other players can also enter the market. So moving ahead with that is really key. Also, there was a recent amendment of a law that allows actually private suppliers to supply or to produce up to 100 megawatt of electricity without actually applying for a license. This is also very important to fill, the electricity gap, because such small projects can be put on stream quite quickly. They are much more quickly to realize than big projects, and they can really help to bridge the electricity gap in the short run. That's very important. And then last but not least, clearly regulatory reforms are key to boost growth in South Africa. In many sectors, competition is very low. The sectors are shielded through a lot of red tape, through also restrictions, to foreign competition. And here, opening up markets is very crucial. For instance, professional services is one example where there's a lot of room to go further to open up these markets, which then would also benefit other, industries that use the services of these sectors as inputs.
Isabell, that's all the time we have tonight. Thank you very, very much for your time. Isabell Koske is the acting head of country studies at the OECD, talking to us about their views on what South Africa needs to do not to fall back to the low growth path that we saw at the height of COVID-19 2 years ago. Well,